Welcome to the Brief News Network.
While Donald Trump was in Washington marking the Supreme Court's decision that dismantled key tariffs on China, something far more consequential was unfolding quietly across the Atlantic. In Paris, inside the headquarters of the OECD, Chinese officials were seated face-to-face with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jameson Greer. What was said during that meeting has not been properly unpacked by most mainstream outlets. China's chief trade negotiator, Vice Minister of Commerce Li Qiangang, delivered a statement that, on the surface, sounded measured and diplomatic. But beneath that calm tone was a clear and calculated warning. He stated, "We are concerned about the potential interference and harm that the outcomes of these investigations may inflict on the hard-won, stable economic and trade relations between China and the United States." Read that carefully. This was not casual diplomatic language or routine rhetoric. It was a deliberate signal. In precise and professional terms, Beijing was telling Washington that if Section 301 investigations continue, there will be repercussions, and not minor ones. What makes this moment fundamentally different from previous U.S.-China tensions over the past several years is this: China no longer relies on tariffs as its primary weapon. It has evolved. It has built alternative levers of power, control over critical materials, dominance in supply chains, and a massive trade surplus. In just 2 months, that surplus reached an astonishing $213 billion. China is no longer fighting with tariffs. It is fighting with infrastructure, logistics, and global dependency. And at this moment, the United States is losing ground in that arena, often without fully realizing it. Stay with this analysis because by the end, the full scope of China's leverage will become clear: what it means for financial systems, for global markets, and for everyday people. The next 90 days could prove to be one of the most pivotal periods in the history of U.S.-China economic relations. Let's step back and establish the context, because every detail matters here. The date is March 15, 2026. The location: Paris, in the discreet and affluent 16th arrondissement. A motorcade arrives quietly at the OECD headquarters. On one side sit Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng and Li Qiangang. Opposite them are Bessent and Greer representing the United States. The discussions begin shortly after 10 a.m. and continue for more than 6 uninterrupted hours. Why Paris? Why the OECD? Because both sides require neutral territory. That alone reveals the current state of relations. This is no longer routine economic coordination. This is a negotiation between two global powers attempting to define the terms of coexistence, with a high-stakes Trump-Xi summit looming in the background. The immediate trigger for this meeting came just days earlier. On March 11, 2026, the United States initiated 2 new Section 301 investigations. One focused on what Washington describes as excess industrial capacity across multiple countries, including China. The other targeted alleged forced labor practices in over 60 nations. Both investigations point toward the same likely outcome: new tariffs, and potentially very significant ones. But here's the deeper layer most observers overlook. Why return to Section 301 at all? Because the Supreme Court removed Trump's most aggressive tool. On February 20, 2026, it ruled that tariffs imposed under emergency powers were unconstitutional. Those tariffs, some reaching as high as 145%, were eliminated overnight. In response, the administration pivoted. Section 301 became the fallback mechanism, the legal pathway to maintain pressure. Economists like Lin Song from ING made it clear: tariffs remain a key negotiating instrument for Trump. Politically, it's a calculated move. Strategically, however, China anticipated it. And here is where the story intensifies. Just 11 days after the U.S. launched its investigations, China responded, not impulsively, but with precision. On March 27, 2026, Beijing initiated 2 counter-investigations. One examines U.S. restrictions on Chinese goods and limitations on advanced technology exports. The other targets barriers placed on Chinese green energy products. Under China's updated foreign trade law, these investigations are not symbolic. They provide legal grounds for retaliation, tariffs, export restrictions, and perhaps most significantly, the blacklisting of American companies through the Unreliable Entity List. If major U.S. corporations are placed on that list, the consequences would be severe. Companies like Apple, Boeing, Tesla, and Qualcomm could lose access to one of the world's largest markets. This isn't theoretical. During the previous trade war, Boeing's Chinese orders were effectively frozen. Apple still relies heavily on Chinese manufacturing networks. These realities translate directly into jobs, stock valuations, and retirement savings for millions of Americans. China's official statements left no ambiguity. They expressed firm opposition and warned that necessary countermeasures would be taken to defend national interests. Some analysts dismiss this as posturing, pointing to China's internal challenges, high youth unemployment, a struggling property sector, and deflationary pressures. Those issues are real. But focusing solely on domestic weakness misses the larger strategic picture. China's leverage today is not rooted in tariffs or short-term economic performance. It is rooted in control over resources and systems that cannot be easily replaced. Consider rare earth elements. These are not abstract commodities. They are essential to modern technology and defense. The F-35 fighter jet depends on rare earth magnets. Electric vehicles, missile systems, semiconductors all rely on components tied to Chinese supply chains. When China briefly threatened to restrict these materials in 2025, it nearly halted parts of the U.S. automotive industry. Approximately 6.5% of American manufacturing jobs depend on supply chains that require these inputs. And China has expanded beyond rare earths. Export controls on silver, tungsten, and antimony are now in place. These materials are critical for solar panels, electronics, and defense systems. Even industry leaders like Elon Musk have publicly expressed concern. The underlying reality is stark. The United States is attempting to economically isolate a country it still depends on for essential materials. That is not strategic strength, it is structural vulnerability. And Beijing understands this fully. But supply chains are only one dimension of the equation. The other is financial power. China has been steadily reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, down from nearly $1.2 trillion to around $683 billion. While some argue this is merely a technical shift through offshore custodians, the broader trend is undeniable. China is gradually decreasing its exposure to U.S. debt. And it is not alone. Japan, the UK, Brazil, and India have all reduced their treasury holdings. This is not a sudden panic. It is a slow, coordinated repositioning. At the same time, central banks worldwide are increasing their gold reserves. In early 2026, gold surpassed U.S. Treasuries as the leading global reserve asset. China itself has been accumulating gold consistently for over a year.
Why?
Because gold cannot be frozen, sanctioned, or controlled by another country. The freezing of Russia's reserves in 2022 fundamentally changed how nations perceive financial risk. Now connect all of this. China is reducing reliance on the dollar, strengthening control over supply chains, diversifying trade partners, and building financial resilience. This is not a reaction to recent events. It is a long-term strategy that has been accelerating. For ordinary Americans, the consequences are tangible. Reduced foreign demand for U.S. debt means higher interest rates. That translates into more expensive mortgages, car loans, and credit. It affects household budgets directly. Meanwhile, tariffs are raising consumer prices. Agricultural exports have collapsed in key sectors like soybeans, forcing the U.S. government to compensate farmers with billions in subsidies. Much of that lost market share has shifted permanently to countries like Brazil. In the short term, neither side emerges unscathed. The United States faces consumer-level pressure, higher costs, and economic uncertainty. China faces systemic challenges, slower growth, and financial strain. But these pressures manifest differently in each political system, and that asymmetry matters. Looking ahead, the upcoming summit is unlikely to produce a sweeping resolution. At best, it may yield temporary, transactional agreements, limited trade concessions, or resource access. The deeper structural conflict will remain unresolved. Both nations are entering negotiations fully aware of each other's leverage. Both are prepared to escalate if necessary. This is no longer just a trade dispute. It is a reconfiguration of the global economic order. And the next 90 days will be critical. The decisions made during this period could shape financial markets, supply chains, and geopolitical dynamics for years to come. The bottom line is simple but profound. China arrived in Paris composed, strategic, and prepared. Its warning was subtle but unmistakable. Backed by economic strength, supply chain dominance, and financial repositioning, it represents not a bluff, but a calculated stance. If misread, the consequences will not be abstract. They will be felt by consumers, workers, and businesses in real, measurable ways. The story is still unfolding. And right now, the next chapter is being written.